The last diplomatic cable. The war room on Earth did not look the way people imagined war rooms looked. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic screens filled with scrolling numbers, no officers shouting across the room at each other. It was a plain space, deliberately plain, with long gray tables and chairs that had been in service for 30 years and had never been replaced because nobody thought new chairs would make the decisions any better. The air recycler hummed quietly in the corner. A cup of cold coffee sat near General Adrian Cross's left hand, forgotten. Nobody had thought about coffee for the last several hours. There were 11 people in the room. They had been there for most of the last 2 days. General Adrian Cross was not the kind of man who gave speeches in moments like this. He was a compact, quiet person who had spent 40 years in service and had seen enough of what war actually looked like. Not the theory of it, not the strategy of it, but the real thing, the blood and wreckage thing, that he had long since stopped treating it as anything other than a catastrophe to be managed as cleanly as possible. He had photographs of his family in a small frame in his office. He had plants on his windowsill. He made his own lunch most days. People who did not know him sometimes expected someone harder. People who knew him understood that the quietness was not softness. It was the opposite of softness. It was what you get when someone has thought about hard things for so long that they no longer need to raise their voice about them. He sat at the head of the table and listened to Fleet Admiral Kara Linden present the full casualty figures from the 14 systems. The room had already heard them twice, but Kara read them again anyway, because these were not numbers that should be summarized or rounded. Each one was a person. The room owed them the full count. Director of Intelligence, Owen Park, presented the analysis of Velthari intentions. It was not complicated. The Velthari had not made a mistake. They had not misread a treaty or stumbled into a conflict they did not want. They had planned the strikes for years, executed them with precision, and immediately followed up with a territorial claim. They had expected, based on everything they knew about human behavior, that this would begin a long negotiation process in which they held all the leverage. They had expected humanity to come to the table with its head down. Owen Park finished his presentation and sat down. General Cross looked around the room. He did not ask for opinions. He did not call for a vote. He just looked. The way someone looks when they want to make sure everyone in the space is present, is real, is here. Because what comes next will be permanent, and he wanted everyone to know that he knew that. He said, "We gave them every chance." It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was just a true sentence, spoken out loud so that it existed in the room. No one disagreed. The last diplomatic cable Earth ever sent to the Velthari Dominion took 4 hours to write, which was a short time for a document of that weight. It went through 7 drafts. Most of the drafts were longer. The final version was 3 sentences. The people who worked on it later said that cutting it down was the right choice, that every word they removed made what was left feel heavier, like stripping the cover off something to show what was underneath. It was not a declaration of war in the formal sense. It set no ultimatums and asked for nothing. It did not threaten. It did not beg. It did not negotiate. It simply informed the Velthari Dominion that humanity had made a decision, that the decision was final, and that what was coming regardless of anything they did next. Not as punishment, and not as anger, as consequence, as the thing that follows when you push something past the place where it can still bend. The cable ended with a single line that was not quite a warning and not quite an apology. It said only that humanity wanted the Velthari to know this was coming, so they could not say they had not been told. It was the kind of thing you say when you have been raised to believe in giving people every possible chance, and you are giving them one last one, even now, even here, not because it will matter, but because that is the kind of people you are. Not out of cruelty, but out of what he genuinely believed was appropriate perspective. His advisors had been thorough. They had modeled a dozen human response scenarios, and in every one, humanity moved with measured force. Targeted strikes on military assets, some economic pressure, a fleet demonstration near Velthari space, followed by a return to the table once both sides had made their points. It was the pattern. It was what humans always did. They were a species that cared too much about life to really commit to taking it. That was the whole point. His lead advisor told him they should expect a first strike within 4 days, limited in scope, designed to signal displeasure without triggering full escalation. What none of them had ever understood, what the entire galaxy had spent generations failing to understand, was where human mercy actually came from. It had never been a limitation. It had never been cowardice or weakness or sentiment clouding judgment. It was a value, a thing chosen deliberately, every single day, by billions of people who believed with genuine conviction that the universe was better when more things in it were alive. When humans stepped back from a fight they had already won, it was not because they could not finish it. It was because they had decided not to. That decision was hard, and it was chosen freely, and it cost them something real every time. The Velthari had just spent 11 years demonstrating, in very clear terms, that this value was not going to be honored or reciprocated. And so humans had made a different decision. Aboard the CNS Iron Gate, Nathan Cole received new operational orders at 4 in the morning. The orders came through on the secure command channel, encrypted and direct, and he read them alone at his station, while the rest of the bridge crew moved quietly around him. He read through the orders, once at normal speed, then went back and read the critical sections again, slowly, to make sure he understood. He understood. He sat still for a moment, looking at the screen. Then he pulled up the navigation maps and started thinking about approach vectors. There was a great deal of work to do, and very little time to waste. Zoe Harmon found him 20 minutes later, already 3 pages deep into tactical calculations. She had seen her own version of the orders. She stood at his shoulder and read a few lines, and then straightened up. "Load everything?" she said. "Load everything," he said. She went to get it done. Neither of them said anything else about it. There was nothing else to say. The part where you talk about your feelings, and whether this is right, and what it means for the kind of people you are, that part was already over. It had been over since the last transmission from Saren's landing. It had been over since the casualty figures came in. It had been over, in truth, the moment the Velthari read 11 years of human restraint, and decided it proved they had nothing to be afraid of. The Iron Gate came about on its new heading. The stars outside the viewport did not look different. The galaxy did not feel different. But something had shifted anyway. Something quiet and large and permanent. And everyone on board knew it, even if no one was saying it out loud. A door had closed somewhere. It would take a long time to understand fully what that meant. But there would be time for understanding later. Right now, there was only what needed to be done. What Deathworlders look like without a leash. The Velthari world of Kethorum was a staging ground. It sat at the edge of what the Dominion considered its operational buffer zone. A wide slice of space that the Velthari had been slowly filling with supply depots, refueling stations, and troop installations over the last decade. From Kethorum, Dominion forces could reach a dozen human frontier systems within 72 hours. It had been chosen carefully for exactly that reason. It was the long arm of the Dominion's reach, and the Velthari High Command considered it one of their most valuable pieces of infrastructure. The human fleet arrived at Kethorum on a Wednesday. There was no formal declaration of engagement. There was no warning shot. There was no period of circling at safe distance while communication channels were opened and diplomatic language was exchanged. The fleet simply came in from 4 directions at the same time, which was not how fleets were supposed to do it, because coordinating 4 simultaneous approach vectors across that kind of distance required a level of timing that most military planners considered impractical. Humanity had practiced it for 3 months in simulation before anyone outside the war room had even known what was coming. It was quiet and invisible, and when it was over, Kethorum was essentially alone, cut off, shouting into a void that could not hear it. Then the rest of the fleet came in. The Velthari commanders sent a ceasefire request through diplomatic channels at hour 4. It was received by the human fleet's communication officer, logged in the official record as received, and then placed into a folder that no one opened. A second request came at hour 9. It was also received, also logged, also placed into the same folder. The Velthari had not expected this. In every conflict they had studied, the ceasefire channel was the beginning of the end, the moment when both sides started feeling out where the deal would be. The ceasefire channel was the door you knocked on when you wanted to start going home. Nobody came to the door. This was the detail that began to move through the conclave like a cold current. Not the scale of the assault, not the precision of the tactics, not even the speed of it. The detail that made other species go quiet in their council rooms and speak in lower voices than usual was the disregard for the ceasefire requests. Because that meant that whatever the Velthari offered next, it would not matter. It meant the outcome had already been decided, and human forces were simply in the process of making it real. On the ground at Kethorum, Captain Lena Park was leading the assault on the surface defense grid. Lena had been in the service for 12 years. She was from a city in the southern part of North America, where summers were long and hot, and people had a reputation for being patient and direct in roughly equal measure. She was both of those things. She was also, at this specific moment in time, a person who had lost people, specific named known people, in the strikes on the 14 colony worlds, and who was moving through the operation with the kind of stillness that her soldiers found steadying, and that the Velthari opposition found deeply unnerving. They had expected something different from human ground forces. Their intelligence briefings on human combat psychology had emphasized emotional volatility, grief, rage, the tendency to make mistakes under extreme stress. They had prepared for an enemy that might fight harder than expected, but would be erratic, driven by feeling, likely to push too far or not far enough, depending on what was happening in the moment. What they got was Lena Park moving in controlled lines through the installation, giving clear orders in a calm voice, adjusting to obstacles without panic, taking losses and continuing forward without hesitation. She felt everything. It sat in her chest like a stone the whole time. But there is a kind of grief that does not make you chaotic. There is a kind that makes you very, very focused. The Velthari had not planned for that kind. Her unit reached the main grid control center in the early afternoon. The installation commander attempted to negotiate surrender terms. Lena listened to the offer, told him it was accepted for the personnel in the room, and then kept going. At the conclave, the mood was shifting in a way that had no good name for it. The Dressy Collective, a people known for careful political calculation and very little open sentiment, sent a private message to Delegate Priya Lawson, requesting to know if humanity would consider pausing operations for a negotiation window. Priya received the message, read it, wrote back a short and courteous reply. She thanked them for their concern, said she understood why they were asking, and explained that the time for that kind of conversation had passed. She was not cold about it. She was not rude. She was the same Priya Lawson who had spent 15 years building relationships in that chamber, who remembered birthdays and asked after families and brought small gifts from Earth when she visited. None of that had changed. But the answer was no, and it was a no that could not be moved. The Urvathi synthesis, who were the oldest civilization in the conclave and who had not fought a war in 6,000 years, sent their eldest voice speaker to Earth itself to ask for restraint. This was not a small thing. The elder, whose name in the Urvathi language took several minutes to say out loud, was one of the most respected figures in known space, and the journey from their homeworld was difficult for someone of his age. He arrived on Earth and was received with every courtesy that humanity knew how to offer. He was given comfortable quarters and good food, and was seen by doctors who made sure his particular biology was being looked after. He was treated well in every possible way. Then he sat with the Human Joint Council and made his case. He was an old being and a wise one, and his words were thoughtful and full of the long perspective that comes from a civilization that had watched many terrible things happen and come out the other side. He spoke for 2 hours. The council listened to every word. At the end, General Cross thanked him sincerely and told him that humanity appreciated everything he had said and everything he had crossed to come here to say it. He said it the same way he said most things, quietly, without anger, with the flat finality of a decision that was not going to be revisited. The Urvathi elder returned home and told his people what he had seen and heard. He told them about the way he had been treated, with warmth, with patience, with real care. He told them that the humans had been genuinely kind to him the entire time. His people listened to this, and many of them were surprised, because kindness had not been what they were expecting to hear about. Then they thought about it a little longer, and they realized that the kindness was somehow the most frightening part of all. Back on the Iron Gate, Nathan Cole was 3 days into the campaign. His ship had been involved in 6 separate engagements. The tactical logs were clean and thorough, and said very little about what it felt like to be inside them. Zoe Harmon kept the station running at a level of efficiency that would have been impressive under normal conditions, and was almost unnatural under these. She slept 4 hours a night, and ate at her station, and did not complain about either of those things. One evening, or what passed for evening in the middle of deep space, Nathan found her sitting in the observation bay, looking at nothing in particular. He sat down near her. They stayed there for a while, without talking. After a long time, Zoe said, "I keep thinking about how long we waited." Nathan did not answer immediately. "How many times we stepped back," she said. "How many times we let it go." He looked at the stars outside the viewport. "Yeah," he said. "And now we're here," she said. Neither of them said anything else for a while. There was not much else to say. The thing that was happening was the thing that was happening, and they were part of it, and there was no clean way to feel about that, and no version of the conversation that made it easier. They sat there, together, 2 people who had spent their whole careers trying to make the universe a safer and more reasonable place, now doing the opposite, because the other thing had stopped working, and there was nothing left to try. Eventually they went back to work. There was still a great deal of it to do. The fall of the Dominion and the silence after. The Velthari Dominion did not fall all at once. It came apart in stages, the way a structure fails when the thing holding it together is removed. And what had been holding the Dominion together? Its sense of security, its confidence in its own permanence, its deep and unexamined belief that it understood the limits of human response. All of that was gone now. What was left was a very large and complicated system, trying to function without the assumption it had been built around. The Velthari High Command had 4 strategic doctrines for defensive war, and human forces had broken the foundations of all 4 within the first 3 weeks. The doctrines were not bad. They were actually quite good, built over centuries of experience, tested in a dozen conflicts with other species. The problem was that they had all been designed with a specific and sensible idea of what fighting a war looked like. 2 sides pushing against each other until one side decided the cost was too high and asked for terms. It was a reasonable idea. It was how most wars in the galaxy had worked for a very long time. Human forces were not operating that way. They did not secure ground and pause. They did not reach a comfortable advantage and wait for the other side to come to the table. They moved continuously, taking each objective and immediately building toward the next one. And the tempo did not slow, and did not vary, and did not offer any natural gap for the Dominion to insert a negotiation into. He sent his ceasefire requests, and then he sent formal requests through neutral conclave channels, and then he tried to reach individual human commanders directly through back channels that the Dominion's intelligence service had spent years cultivating. The commanders received the messages. Some of them even wrote responses. The responses were polite. They said things like, "Message received, and we understand your position, and this communication has been noted in the record." None of them said yes. None of them said, "Here is what you need to do to stop this," because there was nothing left to offer. Velkareth did not understand this for a long time. He kept thinking in terms of what humans wanted, what territory, what resources, what formal acknowledgement would be enough to make them stop. He had advisors working around the clock, building offer packages, finding things the Dominion could give up that were big enough to matter, but not so big as to end them. He thought the problem was that he had not found the right combination yet. It did not occur to him until quite late that there was no combination. That what had happened at Saren's Landing and the other colony worlds had moved the situation past the place where combinations were relevant. Priya Lawson was asked by 3 different conclave delegations to explain what humanity would accept. She gave each delegation the same answer, and it was not a comfortable answer, but it was an honest one. She said, "There was a time when we would have accepted almost anything. You could have come to us at almost any point before this with almost any offer, and we would have found a way to say yes. We believed in finding a way to say yes. We thought the universe worked better when more things in it survived. That version of us would have taken the deal. But that version of us existed alongside the people of Saren's Landing, and those people are gone. The terms we once would have accepted no longer exist, because the people who would have agreed to them are gone with them." There was a long silence in the chamber after she said that. It was the kind of silence that happens when something true and awful has been said clearly, and no one has an argument for it, and no one wants to be the first to break it with something smaller. The Velthari home system was reached on a Tuesday. The battle there was the hardest of the campaign, not because Velthari defenses were at their strongest. They were actually weakened by weeks of sustained pressure, but because home systems mean something. The beings defending it were fighting the way beings fight, when what is behind them is the only thing that matters. Human forces moved into it anyway, with the same pace they had maintained throughout, and it was hard and ugly, and cost them real losses, and they kept going. It ended in the late afternoon, local time on the command ship. General Cross received the final operational report and spent a few minutes alone in his office before he came back out. What he did in those minutes, no one knew. He did not say. When he returned, he was the same as always, quiet, direct, already thinking about what needed to happen next. Fleet Admiral Cara Linden stood at the far end of the room, reading the same report on her tablet, and when she looked up and their eyes met, they held the look for a moment and then looked away. They had both spent their lives in service of preventing moments exactly like this one, being the people who made it happen instead of the people who stopped it. That was a complicated thing to carry, and neither of them had a simple feeling about it. The decision about what to do with the Velthari had been made months earlier and had not changed. Humanity had no interest in extermination. That had never been on the table, and it was never going to be. Every military installation in the home system was dismantled. Every weapons platform was removed. Every vessel capable of deep space travel was either taken apart or brought under human supervision. The Dominion's governing structure, the councils and ministries and bureaucratic layers through which the war had been planned and executed, was dissolved. Their territorial holdings were redistributed among the species the Velthari had spent generations oppressing or ignoring. The historical record of what they had done was preserved in full and made available to the conclave. And then the Velthari civilians, the ordinary ones, the ones who had not launched the strikes, or planned the campaign, or laughed at the ceasefire request, were left alone. Their homes were left standing. Their schools and hospitals and cultural sites were untouched. Their food systems kept running. Their children were not held accountable for decisions made by people above them. Humanity provided aid to the parts of their infrastructure that had been damaged in the fighting, because that was the kind of thing humanity did, apparently even now, apparently even here. It was mercy. It was unmistakably still mercy. But it was mercy that arrived on the far side of something that could not be taken back, and everyone who received it knew the difference. Lena Park took a transport home 3 weeks after the last engagement. She went back to Portland and walked through her neighborhood and sat in a park she had played in as a child and tried to feel normal. Normal was not quite the right word for what she felt. She felt something more like the specific quietness of being a person who has done something large and complicated and now has to figure out how to be a regular person again. She sat in the park for a long time. The birds did not know anything had changed. The trees did not know. The afternoon sun came in the same way it always did. She went home and had dinner with her family and did not talk much, and her family did not push her to. Nathan Cole received his debrief orders and completed them, and then took 2 weeks of approved leave. He spent most of it in his cabin on the Iron Gate before it went in for refit. Not because there was nowhere to go, but because it was where he felt the least like he had to perform being okay. Zoe came by once, and they had coffee and talked about small things, and that was enough. At the conclave, 30 remaining species signed a formal resolution acknowledging the end of hostilities. Behind closed doors, several delegations circulated a private document among themselves. It was not a treaty or a policy proposal. It was a question, a serious and frightened question that nobody had ever needed to ask before, written down because they needed to figure out what to do with it. The question was, what do you do with the knowledge that the most restrained species you have ever encountered just showed you exactly what happens when that restraint runs out? The document went through many drafts. No final answer was ever agreed upon. And outside in the hall, after the session, Priya Lawson stood alone for a moment before her staff came to find her. She looked at the ceiling of the chamber, old stone carved by hands that had lived before humanity had reached for the stars. And she breathed. And she thought about what had been won and what had been lost, and whether those were even two separate things, or just two words for the same thing. Then her staff came, and there was work to do, and she went back to doing it. The nightmare the galaxy still carries. 20 years passed. The galaxy did not go back to what it had been before, because things never go back. They go forward, and sometimes forward looks a little like before, and sometimes it looks like something no one has seen yet. The conclave kept meeting. Species kept arguing and trading and forming alliances and breaking them. Ships moved through the lanes. People were born and grew old. The ordinary machinery of the universe kept running. But something had changed in the way other civilizations talked about humans. Not in the big official statements, not in the formal diplomatic language that filled the conclave records. In the smaller conversations, the private ones, the things species said to each other when they were not being careful. What had changed was this: nobody made the old joke anymore. There had been a joke, not a funny one, but a persistent one, that had moved through alien diplomatic circles for generations. It was about humans and their strange habit of stopping. It had many versions. They all had the same punchline, which was that humans would step back from anything if you pushed the right way. The joke was gone now. Nobody told it. Nobody laughed at it. And in its place was a different kind of quiet. the kind that lives in a room where something happened that people are not quite ready to talk about directly. The Velthari, in the years after the war, became a thoughtful people. This was not something anyone had predicted. The expectation, from most of the conclave, was bitterness, a defeated civilization, nursing its losses and waiting for a chance at something better. What emerged instead was something more complicated. Their philosophers worked steadily through the years, and their most widely read thinker, a woman named Velsora, wrote the text that became the defining document of post-war Velthari culture. It was translated into 47 languages and read in schools and council chambers across the known galaxy. Its title, in plain translation, was "They Had the Power the Whole Time." Its argument was not complicated, but it was one of those arguments that looks obvious after someone has made it, and is invisible before. Velsora wrote that the Velthari had done something very specific and very fatal. They had looked at human mercy and decided it was a ceiling. They had thought, this is the most these beings will ever hold back, and therefore this is what they are. What they had never understood was that mercy freely chosen is not a ceiling. It is a floor. It is what a person returns to, and it only exists, in the first place, because the person could also do something else. The Velthari had spent 11 years pushing against a floor, thinking they were approaching a ceiling, and been astonished when it gave way. Velsora's book had a long appendix that was a record of every moment in the decades before the war where human beings had chosen to step back. Ceasefires offered after clear victories, aid sent to enemies who had just been defeated, treaties signed that gave up advantages humanity had earned. It was a very long list, and Velsora's point, laid out at the end of it, was simple. Every single one of those moments had been a choice, and a choice can be unmade. Nathan Cole read the book in a single sitting on a warm afternoon in the small Colorado town where he had settled after his retirement. He had a house there, not large, with a garden where he grew things that had no practical value. Flowers mostly, and a few herbs that he mostly just looked at, rather than using. His hands were better at caring for plants than he had expected them to be. He found it helped. He finished the book and sat with it for a while. Then he put it on the shelf next to the photograph of Diana, and went out to check on the garden, and thought about the list in the appendix, and about all the times he himself had been part of that list, and about whether any of it had been worth it. He decided it had been. Not because it had prevented what happened, it had not, but because those choices had been made by people who believed in something real, and the believing had been real, even when the outcome was not. He answered letters from veterans groups sometimes, and went to memorials when he could, and otherwise lived quietly, which was what he wanted. Zoe Harmon had gone into diplomatic service. This surprised people who did not know her, and surprised nobody who did. She had a quality that was difficult to describe, but very easy to recognize across a table. A sense of genuine patience, the kind that is not performance, combined with a very precise awareness of exactly how much she was extending it and why. Alien diplomats who worked with her over the years said she was the most effective human envoy they had encountered, and also the one who made them most instinctively careful about honoring their commitments. Not because she threatened anyone, she never did, but because there was something in the room when she was in it that reminded you, quietly and without any drama, that you were dealing with a species that knew the difference between choosing to be kind and being unable to do otherwise. She did good work, a lot of it. Systems that might have become conflicts were instead resolved through her particular combination of warmth and absolute clarity. She was proud of this, in a quiet way, though she rarely talked about it. Lena Park wrote a book. It was not what people expected. There was no detailed account of tactics, no analysis of the campaign, no victory narrative. It was about the weeks after the war ended. It was about driving through a city and watching people buy groceries and argue about small things and laugh at things that were not that funny. It was about sitting in a park and trying to remember how to be a person who was not in the middle of something enormous and terrible. It was about the specific difficulty of returning to ordinary life when ordinary life was exactly what you had been fighting for, but also felt, now, very far away. The book was honest in a way that made people uncomfortable and grateful at the same time. It became required reading in every human military academy, filed under the heading, What We Are Fighting to Return To. Young recruits read it and understood, in a way that no strategy text could explain, why the work mattered beyond the mission. They read it and thought about their own parks, their own groceries, their own small arguments, and understood those things as the point. Priya Lawson served 3 more terms as Earth's delegate to the conclave before she retired. In her final address, the chamber was full. Delegations from every species in the conclave were present, including the Velthari, who had been given observer status 6 years earlier, as part of the slow process of reintegration. She spoke for about 20 minutes. It was the most translated piece of human speech in the conclave's modern era, distributed in complete form to every member world within a week of its delivery. She did not speak about victory. She did not speak about the war at all, really, except as a thing that had happened and that could not be changed. She spoke about what humans were and what they were not, and about the specific things she wanted the galaxy to understand before she sat down for the last time. She said, "We are not a violent species. I know that is a strange thing to say given the history of our planet and the things you have seen us do, but it is true. We are a species that is very, very good at surviving. We learned long before we reached the stars that cooperation survives longer than conquest. We still believe that. We will always believe that. But I need you to understand something important. Our restraint does not come from our limitations. It comes from our values. And values, unlike limitations, can be tested. They can be pushed. They hold and hold and hold. And then, if you push far enough and long enough and hard enough, they reach a place where they cannot hold anymore. We came back to mercy after this war, because mercy is genuinely who we are. We did not perform mercy. We did not calculate it. We returned to it the way you return to home. But we ask you, with everything we have, never to make us leave it again." The chamber was silent for a long time. In the centuries that followed, no species ever again mistook human patience for weakness. Not because they were afraid, though fear was part of it, and it was real, and it was not going away. But because they had all read the record. They had seen the list that Velsora published, all those moments of deliberate restraint. They had understood, at last, what they were actually looking at when they watched a human being choose to hold back. They were looking at a choice, a real one, made every day by billions of people for reasons that mattered to them. The galaxy learned many things from the Velthari War. It learned about military doctrine and strategic patience and the specific vulnerabilities of civilizations that mistake pattern for permanence. But the lesson that lasted the longest was the quietest one. It was the kind of lesson that does not arrive with noise. It settles in slowly, like weather, until one day you realize it has always been there. The most dangerous thing in the universe is not a being that has never known mercy. It is a being that chose mercy freely, every day, for 1,000 years, and was taught, at last, to choose otherwise. The mercy they took for weakness. The galaxy had always found humans strange. Not strange in the way a rare creature is strange, curious and worth studying from a distance. Strange in a way that made other species uncomfortable. The way you feel when you see something that does not fit any category you already have. Humans were violent. Everyone knew that. Their planet had been trying to kill them since before they had names for the things trying to kill them. Their world had monsters in the deep water, poison in the plants, fire in the earth, and storms that could pull entire towns apart. And yet humans had not only survived on that world, they had learned to love it. That was the first thing most species never really understood about them. The second thing was this: humans could fight harder, bleed longer, and absorb more punishment than almost anything else alive in the known galaxy. Their bodies were dense and stubborn. They did not go into shock the way softer species did. They could run for hours without stopping, carry heavy things without mechanical help, and push through pain in a way that other civilizations found difficult to even watch. There was a word the Dressy used for humans in their private records. Translated loosely, it meant the ones who refused to lie down. It was not meant as a compliment. It was meant as a warning they kept mostly to themselves. But here was the thing that really confused everyone. For all their toughness, all their history of war, all the hard evidence that humans were built for survival in a way most species simply were not. They kept stopping. They would fight, and then they would stop. They would win battles and then offer terms. They would have enemies at their mercy, and then feed those enemies and give them water, and sometimes even apologize. Other civilizations had looked at this behavior for generations and reached the same conclusion. It was weakness. It was sentiment getting in the way of logic. It was a flaw in an otherwise remarkable species. Commander Nathan Cole had heard this argument many times. He had sat through diplomatic dinners where alien officials said it to his face, politely, the way someone might point out a small smudge on your uniform. He would smile and not argue, because arguing never changed anything. He had served on the frontier for 15 years. He had seen what the edges of known space looked like. He had watched alien ships push into human territory by small degrees, testing responses, measuring how much they could take before anything serious happened. He filed his reports. He sent his warnings. He did his job. His crew aboard the Deep Space Patrol vessel, CNS Irongate, were good people. Lieutenant Zoe Harmon ran the tactical station with a calm focus that newer crew members found reassuring, once they got used to her habit of going very quiet right before something difficult was about to happen. Dr. Owen Gray had joined the ship 3 years earlier as a xenobiologist and had never quite lost his habit of being amazed by everything, even things that were very clearly threatening. Nathan had come to appreciate that about him. It was useful to have someone on board who still looked at the universe like it was mostly full of interesting things, instead of mostly full of things that wanted to kill you. The Velthari Dominion had been pushing for 11 years. They were an old civilization, sophisticated and proud, with a long memory of being powerful in a part of the galaxy that humans had only recently expanded into. They had watched human ships arrive, watched human colonies take root, watched human fleets patrol with their strange mixed pattern of aggression and restraint, and they had made a careful study of it. Their intelligence reports were thorough. They tracked every time humanity had been provoked and stepped back. They tracked every negotiated settlement, every ceasefire, every moment where humans had chosen compromise over escalation. They built charts. They drew conclusions. Their primary conclusion was that humans had a limit, and that limit was a very safe distance away from anything the Velthari actually cared about doing. So they planned, and they waited, and when they were ready, they moved. The attack came in the early morning hours by Earth time. Across 14 frontier systems, Velthari strike forces hit simultaneously. They had chosen their targets with care. They did not hit military bases first, or fleet stations, or anything that would look like a tactical move in a war. They hit colony worlds. They hit the places where humans had built homes, planted gardens, raised families, and started the quiet and stubborn work of making a new place feel like theirs. The signal those targets sent was deliberate and specific. It said, "You cannot protect what matters to you." It said, "We are not afraid of you." It said, "We have decided this space belongs to us now, and there is nothing you are willing to do about it." Saren's Landing was a colony of about 40,000 people. It sat on a green world 2 days from the nearest fleet station, close enough to feel connected and far enough to feel free. People had gone there for the reasons people always go somewhere new: a chance at something different, more space, more quiet, a life that felt like it was actually theirs. Nathan's younger sister, Diana, had settled there with her husband and their 2 small children 3 years before. She had sent him pictures of the house they were building. She had complained cheerfully about the local insects and sent him a pressed flower from a field near their property. The Velthari strike fleet reached Saren's landing at dawn, local time. It was gone in 6 hours. Diana's last transmission was 22 seconds long. It arrived in fragments, broken up by whatever the Velthari had done to the communication arrays before they finished. Nathan received it while the Iron Gate was already moving toward the system, already knowing they would be too late, already understanding at a deep and terrible level what he was going to find when he got there. He played the transmission once in his cabin with the door closed. He sat with it for a few minutes. Then he stood up, washed his face, went back to the bridge, and kept doing his job. Because there was nothing else to do, and because falling apart would not help anyone. Zoe watched him walk back onto the bridge and said nothing. She understood. She had people too. Back in the conclave chamber, where the great assembly of galactic civilization conducted its formal business, Earth's delegate Priya Lawson stood in front of 31 species and made the case that what had happened was a crime against human life and a violation of every treaty the Velthari had signed. She spoke clearly and without crying, which took more strength than most of the beings in that room would ever know. She laid out the evidence. She named the dead. She asked for formal condemnation and for a unified response. The Velthari ambassador, Vel Karath, listened with his hands folded and his expression arranged into something that looked like polite regret, but was not. When Priya finished, he gave a brief statement. It described the strikes as a necessary action in defense of Velthari's sovereign interests. It contained a territorial claim over the destroyed systems. It expressed, in smooth and practiced diplomatic language, the firm expectation that humanity would respond as it always had, with protests, with demands, with negotiations, with the slow and predictable machinery of a species that always found a reason not to push too hard. He had studied humans carefully. He had read hundreds of years of their history. He had read the wrong chapters.